The room was supposed to be routine. Another hearing, another round of questions, another day on Capitol Hill, but then Pam Bondi started answering. Within minutes, the tone of the entire committee shifted. Senators who expected careful, predictable responses suddenly found themselves facing something very different: sharp comebacks, confident rebuttals, and moments that left the room completely silent. Staffers stopped typing, cameras zoomed in, and several senators looked visibly stunned. Over the course of the hearing, Bondi delivered 5 moments that quickly spread across political circles and legal commentary. Some called them bold, others called them controversial, but everyone agreed on one thing. These were the 5 times Pam Bondi stunned the committee. The first moment happened almost immediately. A senator began with what sounded like a routine question about the independence of the Justice Department. It was the type of opening question that usually sets the tone for the rest of a confirmation hearing. The senator spoke calmly, outlining concerns that many lawmakers often raise during these proceedings: whether a nominee can truly keep politics separate from law enforcement decisions. In Washington hearings, this kind of question is common. Most nominees respond cautiously, offering carefully worded answers designed to avoid controversy. They speak in general terms, emphasizing respect for the law while avoiding statements that might create tension with members of the committee. But Pam Bondi didn't approach the moment that way. Instead of giving a vague or overly diplomatic answer, Bondi leaned slightly toward the microphone and delivered a response that was calm, clear, and direct. Her tone remained steady, but the message was unmistakable. She began by acknowledging the concern behind the question. Public trust in the Justice Department, she explained, depends heavily on the perception that investigations are guided by the law rather than political pressure. But then she took the point one step further. Bondi stated plainly that federal prosecutors do not get to choose cases based on what might be politically popular or politically convenient. Investigations, she said, must begin and end with the same standard, evidence. That statement alone drew attention in the room. But she didn't stop there. She continued by emphasizing that public perception, media narratives, and political debate cannot replace the legal standards that prosecutors are required to follow. Decisions about investigations must be based on facts, sworn testimony, and the application of the law, not the political climate of the moment. The response was not delivered with raised voices or dramatic language. In fact, it was the opposite. Bondi spoke in a measured tone, choosing her words carefully, almost as if she were delivering a legal argument rather than a political statement. Yet the effect inside the hearing room was immediate. Several senators who had been reviewing notes looked up. Staff members seated behind them paused their typing. Even some reporters in the press section leaned forward slightly, sensing that the tone of the hearing had just shifted. For a brief moment after Bondi finished speaking, no one said anything. The silence didn't last long, but it was noticeable. Hearings on Capitol Hill are rarely quiet. Senators often move quickly from one question to the next, keeping the pace fast and the conversation controlled. But in that moment, the room seemed to pause as everyone processed what had just been said. Observers later described the exchange as a turning point in the hearing. What had started as a routine procedural question suddenly felt more significant. The conversation was no longer just about confirming a nominee or reviewing a sum. Instead, it had become part of a much larger debate: how the Justice Department should balance legal independence with the intense political pressures that surround high-profile investigations. Some members of the committee appeared satisfied with Bondi's answer. Others looked unconvinced, preparing to challenge her further as the hearing continued. But regardless of where anyone stood politically, one thing had become clear: the hearing was no longer going to be predictable. And if the opening exchange was any indication, the committee and the audience watching from outside the chamber were about to witness a series of moments that would define the entire day. The second moment quickly became one of the most talked about exchanges of the entire hearing. By this point, the questioning had begun to intensify. Senators were no longer asking simple introductory questions. Instead, they started raising broader concerns about the role of the Justice Department and how it might operate under future leadership. During one particularly pointed round of questioning, Mazie Hirono introduced a phrase that immediately caught everyone's attention. She warned about the possibility that the Justice Department could become what critics sometimes describe as a department of revenge. The phrase hung in the air for a moment. It was a sharp line, one that suggested the risk of federal law enforcement being used to pursue political opponents rather than enforce the law impartially. In a hearing room where every word is carefully chosen, the wording was clearly meant to provoke a response. Several senators looked up from their notes. Reporters sitting in the back of the chamber quickly began typing. Moments like this often turn into the headlines that dominate the news cycle. Later that evening, all eyes turned toward Pam Bondi. Bondi didn't interrupt the senator. She allowed the question to finish completely, keeping her posture steady and her expression composed. Then she paused briefly before speaking. The pause itself was noticeable. In high-pressure hearings, silence can sometimes say as much as the words that follow. It gave the impression that Bondi was choosing her response carefully rather than reacting emotionally to the accusation. When she finally spoke, her tone remained calm. Bondi began by rejecting the characterization outright. She stated clearly that the Justice Department's role is not to pursue political retaliation but to enforce the law according to established legal standards. Then she laid out what she described as the core foundation of federal prosecution: facts, evidence, and the rule of law. Investigations, she explained, must follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of which political party or public figure might be involved. She emphasized that prosecutors take an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. That oath, she said, binds them to the law itself, not to any administration, political movement, or ideological agenda. The message was direct but measured. Bondi did not raise her voice or challenge the senator personally. Instead, she shifted the focus of the conversation away from political accusations and back toward legal principles, and that was what made the moment stand out. In many hearings, exchanges like this can quickly escalate. Senators and witnesses sometimes talk over each other, leading to heated back and forth arguments that dominate television coverage, but that didn't happen here. Bondi's response remained composed from beginning to end, rather than fueling the confrontation. She framed the issue in broader terms: what the Justice Department is supposed to represent and how its credibility depends on following the law consistently. The effect in the room was subtle, but noticeable. For a few seconds after she finished speaking, the chamber became unusually quiet. Some senators glanced toward one another. Others simply looked down at their notes, preparing the next question. Reporters continued typing rapidly, aware that the exchange had just produced one of the most memorable lines of the hearing. Legal analysts watching the proceedings later pointed out that the moment illustrated a larger tension surrounding modern Justice Department debates. The constant concern that legal investigations could be interpreted through a political lens, whether people agreed with Bondi's answer or not. Her response had clearly landed, and as the hearing moved forward, it became increasingly clear that the questioning and the stakes were only going to grow more intense. The third moment unfolded midway through the hearing, just as the questioning began shifting toward a more personal line of inquiry. Up to that point, many of the questions had focused on policy, legal philosophy, and the future direction of the Justice Department. But hearings like this often move into another territory as well, examining a nominee's past affiliations and whether those experiences might influence future decisions. That's exactly where the conversation turned next. One senator began pressing Pam Bondi about her previous political connections and public roles. The question wasn't entirely unexpected. Bondi had spent years in high-profile legal and political positions, including serving as Florida's Attorney General and participating in national political campaigns. The senator suggested that those past associations could raise concerns about neutrality. Could someone with a visible political background truly separate those experiences from the responsibility of overseeing federal legal matters? It was a question that nominees in Washington have faced many times before. In similar situations, witnesses often respond by listing their qualifications or reassuring the committee that they can remain impartial. Some try to distance themselves from their political past, emphasizing their professional credentials instead. But Bondi approached the moment differently. Rather than immediately defending herself, she turned the conversation in an unexpected direction. She responded with a question of her own. Bondi asked the committee whether it believed that any Attorney with political experience should automatically be disqualified from public service. For a brief moment, the room went quiet again. The question was simple, but it carried significant weight. Instead of addressing only her own record, Bondi had broadened the discussion to something much larger, the role of political experience in government service. Her point was clear. Many lawyers who eventually serve in high-level government roles have, at some point, been involved in politics. Some have worked on campaigns. Others have advised elected officials. Still others have held elected office themselves before returning to legal work. If all of those experiences were treated as automatic disqualifications, Bondi suggested, the government would lose a large portion of its most experienced legal professionals. The framing shifted the dynamic of the exchange. Instead of defending herself against criticism, Bondi placed the committee in the position of explaining where it believed the line should be drawn. Could legal professionals maintain impartiality even if they had once participated in politics? Or should public service roles be limited only to those with no political history at all? Several senators appeared to reconsider the direction of the questioning. Some shifted in their seats. Others looked down at their notes, perhaps preparing a follow-up that addressed the broader issue Bondi had just raised. The exchange highlighted a difficult balance that has long existed in Washington. On one hand, lawmakers want to ensure that the Justice Department and other federal institutions remain politically neutral. On the other hand, many of the individuals most qualified to lead those institutions have spent years navigating the political system. Separating experience from perceived bias is not always simple. That tension became visible in the room as the discussion continued. Legal commentators watching the hearing later pointed to that moment as a strategic pivot. By reframing the question, Bondi shifted the focus away from her personal affiliations and toward a larger institutional debate. It didn't end the scrutiny surrounding her background, but it did change the tone of the conversation, and from that point forward, the committee's questions seemed to move in a slightly different direction, less focused on past political TIs and more focused on how Bondi believed legal independence should function in practice. In a hearing filled with tense exchanges, it was another moment that demonstrated how a single question could reshape the entire discussion. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the hearing came later in the session. After several hours of increasingly intense questioning. By that point, the atmosphere inside the committee room had grown noticeably heavier. Senators had already debated legal philosophy, political independence, and the responsibilities of federal prosecutors. The earlier exchanges had drawn attention, but this next moment carried a different kind of weight. It began during a discussion about public confidence in federal law enforcement. One senator raised a concern that had been circulating widely in political and legal circles. The idea that political conflicts in Washington had begun to erode the public's trust in major institutions, including the Justice Department. The senator suggested that ongoing investigations and high-profile legal battles had created a perception, fair or not, that politics might be influencing decisions that was supposed to remain strictly legal. It was not an accusation directed solely at one administration or one political party. Instead, it reflected a broader anxiety about whether Americans still believed that federal law enforcement operated independently of political pressure. The question was carefully phrased, but the implication was clear. If trust had been damaged, how could it be restored? All eyes turned once again toward Pam Bondi. Bondi did not respond immediately. Instead, she listened carefully as the senator finished speaking. She maintained a calm expression, occasionally nodding slightly, signaling that she understood the seriousness of the concern being raised. When she finally began her answer, her tone was measured and deliberate. She started by acknowledging the point directly. Public trust in institutions, she said, is essential for the justice system to function effectively. Without that trust, even the most legitimate investigations can be questioned, and the credibility of the system itself can begin to weaken. But then she shifted the focus to what she believed was the real solution. Bondi argued that trust cannot be rebuilt through press conferences, political messaging, or attempts to shape public perception. Instead, she said, it must come from something far more fundamental: consistent adherence to the law. Prosecutors must apply the same legal standards in every case, the same rules, the same procedures, the same commitment to evidence. According to Bondi, The public ultimately judges institutions not by what they say, but by what they do over time. As she continued speaking, the room grew quieter. Then she added a line that caught many in the chamber by surprise. Bondi stated that the Justice Department should never become an arena for settling political scores. No matter which party happens to be in power at any given time, the statement was simple, but it carried a powerful implication. In Washington, where political rivalries often dominate headlines, the idea of keeping law enforcement completely separate from political conflict is easier said than done. Yet Bondi's comments suggested that maintaining that boundary was essential to preserving the credibility of the entire system. For a moment, the room went completely still. No one interrupted her. No senator immediately jumped in with a follow-up question. Even the quiet background sounds that usually fill a hearing room, papers moving, keyboards tapping, seemed to pause. It was one of those rare moments in a congressional hearing when the impact of a statement could be felt across the room. Some senators appeared thoughtful, reflecting on the broader principle she had just raised. Others simply watched, waiting to see how the discussion would continue. Eventually, the hearing moved forward, and the next round of questions began, but for several seconds, the silence in the room spoke for itself. By the end of the hearing, the atmosphere inside the committee room felt very different from how it had started earlier that day. Over the course of several hours, tensions had risen and fallen repeatedly. Some exchanges had been calm and technical, focusing on legal procedures and institutional responsibilities. Others had been sharper, touching on politics, public trust, and the role of federal prosecutors in a highly polarized environment. Senators had pressed hard with their questions. At times, the discussion became intense, but now the hearing was approaching its final moments. As the questioning concluded, the committee chair allowed the nominee to deliver closing remarks. These final statements are often brief and procedural, typically a short expression of gratitude followed by a reaffirmation of qualifications. But when Pam Bondi began speaking, it quickly became clear that she intended to take a slightly different approach. Instead of revisiting the specific disagreements that had surfaced throughout the hearing, Bondi stepped back and addressed the larger issue that had hovered over nearly every exchange that day: public confidence in the justice system. She acknowledged that Americans across the political spectrum often hold very different views about high-profile investigations and legal decisions. In today's political climate, she said, nearly every major legal development can quickly become part of a broader political debate. But despite those disagreements, Bondi emphasized that one principle must remain constant: the Justice Department must be guided by the law and by the law alone. She explained that the legitimacy of the entire system depends on one simple idea: the law must apply equally to everyone, not selectively, not politically, equally. The way she delivered the statement was notable. There was no dramatic pause designed for applause, no raised voice meant to dominate the room. Instead, Bondi spoke quietly and deliberately, choosing each word with the same careful tone she had used throughout the hearing. Yet the simplicity of the message seemed to resonate. Several senators seated along the long committee dais nodded slightly as she spoke. Others sat with their hands folded, watching closely, but saying nothing. Staff members standing along the walls remained still, listening as the final statement unfolded. Even some reporters in the press section slowed their typing for a moment, recognizing that the hearing was drawing to its conclusion with a broader reflection, rather than another confrontation. Bondi continued by stating that disagreements between political parties are inevitable in a democracy. Debate, criticism, and oversight are all part of the system, but the Justice Department, she said, must remain anchored to a single responsibility: applying the law consistently and fairly, regardless of who might be affected by the outcome. Without that consistency, public confidence begins to erode, and once that confidence disappears, rebuilding it becomes far more difficult. Her closing remarks lasted only a few minutes, but when she finished, the weight of the moment lingered in the room. The committee chair thanked her for her testimony. Papers were gathered. Microphones were adjusted. Senators began preparing to leave the chamber. The hearing was officially adjourned. Yet it was clear that the day had produced more than routine testimony. Throughout the hearing, several moments had stood out: exchanges where a single answer shifted the tone of the discussion or forced the committee to reconsider the direction of its questioning. These were not moments of shouting or theatrical confrontation. Instead, they were moments of clarity, moments when a carefully delivered response changed the atmosphere of the entire room, and as the cameras powered down and the audience slowly filtered out of the chamber, one thing was certain: those moments would continue to be discussed long after the hearing itself had ended, because sometimes the most memorable events in Washington are not the loudest ones. Sometimes they are the quiet answers that leave an entire room thinking, and in this hearing, that happened 5 different times. If you found this breakdown interesting and want to see more moments like these from major political hearings, make sure to like the video so more people can discover it. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into courtroom showdowns, congressional hearings, and the moments that shape major legal debates. And don't forget to share this video with someone who follows politics or legal news. You never know which moment might spark the next big discussion. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.